Hi, everyone, and thanks for checking out this movie review. So, today I'll be continuing with my current horror franchise, and that's the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And so, today we'll be taking a look at the seventh film in the franchise, which is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So, yeah, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I'll just start out by looking at my notes here and going through the setup and the premise of the movie, and then I'll get into my thoughts and review, which will contain spoilers as normal. So, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, also known as Nightmare on Elm Street 7, although I don't know anybody that calls it that. It's a 1994 American meta slasher film written and directed by Wes Craven, the creator of the original. A standalone film and the seventh installment in the series, it is not part of the same continuity as the previous films, instead portraying Freddy Krueger as a fictional movie villain who invades the real world and haunts the cast and crew involved in the making of the films about him. In the film, Freddy is depicted as closer to what Craven originally intended, being much more of a menacing and much less comical, with an updated attire and appearance. That's a pretty good way to sum it up, I would say. So we start out with being introduced to Heather Langenkamp, who lives in Los Angeles, the actress, of course, who played Nancy Thompson in the original movie and the third movie. She's with her husband Chase and their young son Dylan, played by Miko Hughes. She is recognized for her role as Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street film series before focusing her career on television. One night, she has a nightmare that her family is attacked by a set of animated Freddy Krueger claws from an upcoming nightmare film, where two workers are brutally killed on set. Waking up to an earthquake, she spies cuts on Chase's fingers exactly like the one he received in the dream, but she quickly dismisses the notion that it was caused by the claws. Heather receives a call from an obsessed fan who quotes Freddy Krueger nursery rhyme in an eerie Freddy-like voice. This coincides with a meeting she has with New Line Cinema, where she has pitched the idea to reprise her role as Nancy in a new Nightmare film, which, unbeknownst to her, Chase has been working on. When she returns home, she sees Dylan watching her original film. When she interrupts him, he has a severely traumatizing episode where he screams at her. The frequent calls and Dylan's strange behavior causes her to call Chase. He agrees to rush home from his workplace in Palm Springs as the two men from the opening dream sequence did not report to work. Chase falls asleep while driving and is slashed by the Freddy claw that comes out of the seat, and he dies. His death seems to affect Dylan even further, which concerns Heather's longtime friend and former co star John Saxon. He suggests she seek medical attention for Dylan and for herself, and she has a nightmare at Chase's funeral in which Freddy tries to take Dylan away. So I know that's a lot there. That's kind of the introduction to the film, the first half hour or so, I would say, that gets us into the movie. As far as who's in the movie, so we have Robert Englund, both as himself, the actor, and the entity slash Freddy Krueger. We have Heather Langenkamp as herself and Nancy Thompson, Robert Shea as himself, the producer, Miko Hughes as Dylan, John Saxon as himself and Donald Thompson, Middendorf as Julie, the babysitter, David Newsom as Chase Porter, Fran Bennett as Dr. Christine Hefner, and Wes Craven as himself, the director. So yeah, this is obviously just from the premise and the setup there. This is obviously a very unique film to the franchise. Um, a lot different. As I mentioned earlier, it's not part of the same continuity of the first six films, which are within movies. And this film actually calls them out that they're movies, and now this is like the real world kind of film. Um, Very meta. It's definitely a very meta film, which was actually really ahead of its time when it came out in 1994. The reason it didn't do as well at the box office is because it was so far ahead of its time, and people just weren't ready for this kind of movie yet, I guess, even though it was really well reviewed. So I'll get into my thoughts and review on this movie. So first, I'll start with the pros. I really enjoyed the meta-ness of this film. Maybe I'm ahead of my time. I'm not sure, but the fact that the movie combines the films that were made with real life and really blurs those lines at different points throughout the movie. It's just brilliant. I mean, I love the fact that there's always a script around, and you see the words on the script that have just been spoken in that scene. It's so brilliant, so creative, so original. I just love it. It's great. It's a brilliantly written. I think it's the best written nightmare film since Dream Warriors. You have to go back four films. Very well written, very well directed by Wes Craven, who, in my opinion, fittingly puts his final stamp or his stamp on the final Nightmare movie, I should say. Because in a lot of ways, this is the final Nightmare on Elm Street movie. I know there's two more movies that came out after this, but one is a crossover movie and the other is a remake. So as far as the original series goes, this is really the final this is really the final nightmare as opposed to what they called the previous film, The Final Nightmare. And thank God that it is. Thank God Wes Craven came back and gave this series the closure that we all wanted and a much better fitting end. Um, Great character study in this movie regarding how all those involved, not just the actors and actresses, but the producers, the assistants, the directors, everybody involved with all these movies, how their lives are so different from these movies over the course of 10 years. I thought that was really interesting and kind of um, it's a little bit kind of under the surface a little bit. You really watch the movie and think about it, and they show how obviously, especially for Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund. I mean, you even see one scene with Robert Englund playing Freddy, and afterwards he's signing autographs as Heather Langenkamp is sitting there waiting, patiently checking her watch. Nobody wants her autograph, so it's just. I don't know. I really enjoyed that scene actually in the movie. It's just a great character study, though. Good performances for the most part in this movie. You got obviously got to talk about Heather Langenkamp. I think it's her best performance of any movie that I've seen her in, nightmare film or non-nightmare film. I mean, and I really like her in one and three. Don't get me wrong; she's great in the original. The best final girl, one of the best final girls in horror history, without a doubt. But in this movie, I just think the age that she's at, the maturity, you really follow her through this story. She just delivers brilliantly. She has great chemistry both with Chase and her son Dylan in the movie. Great dialogue with John Saxon when they're talking in the park and towards the end of the movie. Just she's just great in the movie, as is Robert Englund, of course, who's definitely returned to form when he plays Freddy, and also as himself. This is the Robert Englund that I love in this movie and the earlier movies too, as opposed to the Final Nightmare, which we don't need to bring that up again. Yeah, and John Saxon's good. And I actually think Miko Hughes is pretty good. I know some people have panned his performance and say it's over the top, but it was supposed to be that way. I think Miko Hughes is pretty good as a child actor and one of the better child actors in horror movies, quite frankly. He was obviously in Pet Cemetery as well. Um, I think that Bob Shea and Wes Craven, who aren't actors, obviously, you can kind of tell when they're giving their lines in the movie. There's one scene with Bob Shea and a couple with Wes Craven, or maybe just one. I'm not sure, but you can tell that they're a little bit off. But I mean, it's not horrible. I've actually seen actors do worse than they did, which says something. Um, I like the look of Freddy in this movie, the slick new look of the first of all the darker red and green sweater, the new glove that he uses, which actually looks more like a skeleton hand. It has like bone claws coming out of it uh, with the razors, and I like the makeup of Freddy in this movie. Very like it's almost like German like, very slick. Yeah, just a really dark portrayal of Freddy as well by Robert Englund and Wes Craven. I know Wes Craven said when he took over this movie or made this movie, he said Freddy was not to be the wisecracker that he's become in the last three movies of this series. That it was a return to form, a return to what made Freddy Krueger a true horror icon as he was in the first three movies. So obviously, I appreciate that, as I'm sure many diehard Nightmare fans do. Um, yeah, he's Freddy's definitely dark in this movie. Doesn't joke at all, really. He does. His one-liners are more sadistic again, kind of like they were in the first couple movies. Like when he says, "Pick out a pet for the child," or "Pick out a pet for your son, bitch," and towards the end of the film, stuff like that. So, um, the film's really well shot. There's great camera work that's done in this movie. Overall, just a really creative and effective story that includes a huge love letter to the die-hard Nightmare fans. This was a much better way to wrap up the franchise than the previous three films were, especially Freddy's Dead, the one right before this. Yeah, it's there's a lot of cuts from the original movie either on TV or they actually act them out in this movie as part of reality versus the film world. It's just great. There's an effective score that's different and unique from the other movies, but I think it really works and it's effective because this movie's different from the other films in the series. So it makes sense that the score shouldn't be exactly the same. Kind of like Freddy's look isn't exactly the same. So that stuff all works for me. As far as cons go, I do have a couple. It's not a perfect movie, but I think the ending where there's the big confrontation with Heather and her son Dylan and Freddy and his nether world or whatever you want to call it. I think it's a little bit over the top for this kind of movie. The first two-thirds of this movie that they were going for, it just doesn't really fit. The ending almost seems like it would work better with one of the sillier films in this franchise. So I didn't really like that. Some of the special effects, namely the CGI, are not good and haven't aged real well in this movie. Particularly like the highway scene. That one's really is really jarring how it stands out, not in a good way. The melting of Freddy at the very end, um, where he hit the death of him, basically, where he melts in the fire, and the opening of his mouth to swallow Dylan. Those all look pretty silly, and they just don't hold up very well. The movie's kind of a slow burn overall, which isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea. I didn't mind it. I was enthralled and interested throughout the movie because it was a well written movie and I cared about enough of the characters. But it is a slow burn. You don't see Freddy until I think an hour and 8 minutes into the film, and it's an hour and 45-minute film. So it's a lot of setup the first hour. You don't actually see Freddy, well, the real world Freddy on screen. He's in a you see the movie version of Freddy in the beginning of the film where she does a talk show interview kind of thing. But the Freddy that we get in this film, the entity Freddy, you don't see for an hour and 8 minutes. Yeah, and besides that, the kills are a little lackluster in this movie. There's only two that are actually on screen, and one of them's a copy from the first movie. Actually, you could argue they're both copies. And then when her husband gets killed in the truck, that's kind of an homage, even though I don't know if it was intended to be to when Dan was killed in part five driving his truck. Um, Even though I guess they died differently with the claw coming out of the seat and killing Chase, her husband. I don't know. The kills just weren't great. They weren't terribly creative. There was blood, definitely blood and gore, but um, just not very creative. I also don't think Freddy's death was great. You set up this character in this movie, and he gets pushed into like a fireplace or fire pit, and then he burns up. I don't know. I mean, I guess it's okay, but I mean, it's certainly better than Freddy's dead. Don't get me wrong. Any kill of Freddy's better than that. But I'm not sure I would rank it against the rest of them. Maybe I'll do a video on that, like the top Freddy kills from all the different movies once I'm done with this series. But yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. I really enjoy this film for what it is. It's unique, it's meta, it's different. It was ahead of its time, but it's wonderfully written, wonderfully directed by the horror master, and quite frankly, the Nightmare on Elm Street master, Wes Craven. Great to see Robert Englund, John Saxon, Heather Langenkamp playing themselves in this movie, as well as obviously Robert Englund playing the versions of Freddy, both the movie version and the entity version. Yeah, a lot really works for me in this movie, and my favorite part about it is just such a much better way to wrap up the original series, the first seven films. It's a love letter to the fans, but it's also got an effective story, so it isn't like they're dropping Easter eggs at the expense of the story. Yeah, I love this film. I'm going to give it 8.5 out of 10 um, on my rating. 8.5 out of 10 for Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Really enjoyed it. That's my review. Go ahead and like this video and give me your thoughts. Comment down below, guys, on what you thought of this movie. Please subscribe to my channel to see future Nightmare reviews as well as the ranking and the next series that I'll have coming up this summer, horror franchise that I'll be ranking. So thank you for watching this video and have a great day. Bye.